That's a start. And we may have one more joining us. I think Kershaw and Scott were planning to be here today. Anyway, so we're looking at commission rules today. And like I said last week, this is the important part to keep you out of trouble, but it's also probably not the most exciting stuff, unless you plan on going to work for the FCC as an investigator. Oh, that's over there. Okay, so rules and regulations, Part 97. We're going to first look at some definitions. We're going to take a look at what the FCC defines as interference. We're going to look at repeater frequency coordinators and the ITU. Who knows what the ITU is? International Telecommunications Union, I believe. We'll find out here in a minute. Hopefully the class won't prove me wrong. Anyway, FCC regulations, FCC regulates and enforces amateur radio service rules. The basis and purpose of the amateur radio service is advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. Are my slides showing? Yeah. All right. And also remember that definition, because that might come in handy next week when you're taking the test. Advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. Which agency regulates and enforces the rules for the amateur radio service in the U.S.? Charlie, the FCC, that is correct. Which of the following is part of the basis and purpose of the amateur radio service? Charlie, advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of radio art. Beacon. Now, normally, under normal circumstances, in amateur radio, everything is supposed to be two-way communications, but there are a few, very few, allowable one-way communications. Beacon is one of them, and Beacon is an amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. So if you can hear a beacon from someplace, then you know that your propagation to that area is good, and you can maybe make some communications there, some contacts. Most radio propagation beacons. How you doing, Greg? Vince is not, usually Vince is always here, and he's been wanting to see you, but he's not here yet today. Okay. Anyway, most radio propagation beacons use amateur radio frequencies, and they can be found on pretty much any segment of the spectrum there that amateur radio is on. Low frequency, medium, high, VHF, and UHF. And microwave frequencies. Microwave beacons are also used as signal sources to test and calibrate antennas and receivers. Satellite beacons are used for ionospheric research, normally transmit in the VHF or UHF bands. So the definition of a space station is an amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth. And the distance above the Earth there is a critical factor. I think 50 kilometers is about 30 miles or 31 miles, something like that. Most space stations are located on satellites that orbit the Earth. These stations are frequently either transponders or repeaters that operate under automatic control and can be used by ground stations. And a ground station is any station that is not a space station to relay their signal to other ground stations. So, next question. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? Delta, an amateur station transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? Charlie, an amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above Earth's surface. It's almost like I told you guys to remember that, right? Part 97 definitions. Harmful interference is interference which endangers the functioning of radio navigation service or other safety service, or seriously degrades. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Greg. Seriously degrades, obstructs, or repeatedly interrupts a radio telecommunications service operating in accordance with radio regulations. And yeah, willfully interfering is going to get you, if somebody's going to say something. Amateur stations should never willfully interfere with other amateur stations. Now, keep in mind that just because you can hear somebody doesn't mean somebody else. So if somebody's gabbing on a frequency that you're already on, if somebody tries to start up a conversation there, they may not be able to hear the other party talking. So if they start talking while you're silent and you're trying to listen, doesn't necessarily mean they're willfully interfering. They may just be that they don't hear it. When is willful interference to other amateur stations permitted? At no time. The FCC assigns repeater frequency responsibility to the volunteer regional frequency coordinators. At one time, I thought that everybody could have a part in voting for this, but when I read this, what I see is that volunteers are selected by local amateurs whose stations are eligible to be repeaters. So is that right? You have to have a vote in that, you have to have a repeater station, is the way it sounds to me, or an auxiliary station. They recommend transmit and receive channels, which are frequently called frequency pairs, for repeaters. Right. Yeah. Other nearby repeaters. Yeah. Which of the following entities recommends transmit receive channels and other parameters, which would be your PL tones and such, for auxiliary and repeater stations? Bravo, the volunteer frequency coordinators recognized by local amateurs. Who selects a frequency coordinator? Charlie, amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeaters or auxiliary stations. Frequency allocations and power outputs. In pretty much every area, you're going to have maximum allowable power. And because we're all amateurs, because the class is for technicians, your allowable power may be a little bit lower than the standard that everybody else goes by. Operation outside the amateur radio bands is a serious offense. So technicians, you need to understand what you have privileges on. Technicians have limited privileges on HF. And when I say limited, I mean very limited. On 10 meters only, which is the 28 megahertz band, it's like 28 to 29.7 or something like that. You're going to have a little tiny piece down there at the bottom from 28.3 megahertz to 28.5 megahertz. And that's where you can enjoy voice on HF. Now, keep in mind that the vast majority, in fact, all of the voice that you're going to find on there is going to be single sideband. So don't let yourself get excited and roped into buying a radio that transmits on 28 FM. Okay, because you're not going to find anything there. FM is just not a very popular mode for HF. So you're going to have HF on 10. You're going to have single sideband privileges for phone, 28.3 to 28.5. Remember those frequencies. If you decide to build an antenna, you would want to center it on, you would want to set it so that it's best at 28.4. Okay? That way you but as it spreads out away from 28.4, you'll still be in. You will also have, does anybody here do CW? Has anybody got experience with that? Okay, so CW, everybody remembers, is Morse code. So you're tapping things out on a key. If you happen to do that on 80, 40, and 15, you will be able to use CW up to 200 watts. You can't go up to the full 1500 watts. CW data and single sideband phone on 10 meters and 200 watts. Full privileges from VHF and up. Now, where does VHF start in the spectrum? It's anything from 30 to 300 megahertz, right? So that includes your 6 meter band, your 1.25 meter band, 2 meter band, 70 centimeter band, and all those microwave frequencies up there in the 23 and 33 centimeters. Okay, so you get full privileges on VHF, UHF. That means you can go all the way up to 1500 watts PEP. Who knows what PEP is? Peak envelope power. The best description I could find for peak envelope power is, everybody remembers earlier when we were talking about AM communications, and I showed the little envelope where it was a sine wave on the top, an inverse sine wave on the bottom, and a frequency filled in the center, right? That's your modulation envelope. Well, single sideband is only half of that. But those peaks, that is the average of those peaks, is what they call the peak envelope power. So when you raise your voice and you talk louder, the peaks go up a little higher. When you soften your voice and talk lower, then the peaks don't go up quite as high. But the average of that is what they describe peak envelope power as. I always thought it was the maximum would be the peak envelope power, but the descriptions that I found said that it was the average. And then, so everything above from 50 megahertz and up, well, 30 megahertz and up, but as far as the bands that amateurs use, 50 megahertz and up is 1500 watts, with the exception of 1.25. 1.25, which is a 220 band, has a more limited thing on power. So you're only limited to 50 watts. And you'll be hard pressed to find a 1.25 meter radio that transmits higher than 25 anyway. So this gives you a little idea. Remember I said 28.3 to 28.5 for 10 megahertz at the bottom for single sideband and phone. You can also, within the same range, use data, digital and data, and you're limited to 200 watts. And there you see the other bands that you're allowed to use for CW, for Morse only. And they're very, very limited sections, okay? But it does give you a little taste if you decide you want to. And it's designed to give you a reason to go ahead and upgrade to general. There's 2 seats right up here, Kershaw. I'm sorry about the arrangement here. Little miscommunication, and they thought they had room to bring the... how are you today? Okay. All right, so this is the first lesson. We're 23 slides into it, but you didn't miss much. Okay, and there's another chart of frequency. Well, this is the first one. Back on the first one again, you'll notice that that's all HF and medium frequency and low frequency. Actually, I think that's medium and HF. But this one here, you'll notice, is all VHF spectrum. So you've got 50 or 1500 watts full privileges on everything, and then on the 220 band, you've got 50 watts. Remember that I can't remember if that's a test question or not, but the fixed digital message forwarding system that's all that's allowed on that 219 to 220. Okay, you can't get on there for voice or CW. It's only fixed digital message forwarding. and you're allowed up to 50 watts. And then from 220 to 225, all modes are available. If you've got a buddy across town that you like to talk to and you have a hard time finding space, which you probably won't around here, on either 70 or 2 meters, it might be in your best interest to get a 1.25 handheld or a radio that you can talk to your buddy on, because those bands are always, that band is always open. There's always space available on there to find a frequency to talk. Very few people use it. One of the reasons that I think might influence that is that other countries don't have that. So why would Japan build a radio for that band that they don't have? So there's not very many radios for it either, but you can find them. Which frequency? Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. Remember that earlier in the session here, or earlier in the classes, I recommended that you get a rough idea of what frequencies are covered in each band, okay? And then if you did that and you can remember all that, when you look at this next page here, you're going to immediately notice that 2 of them are non-factors. And the other one is close and 1 is in. So it makes it, even if you don't remember the full frequency band or you don't remember the math to be able to convert it, you can use it like that. So which frequency is in the 6 meter amateur band? Bravo, 52.525. So 6 meters is 50 to 54 megahertz. Okay, so you'll notice A is just slightly out. But C is HF, it's not 6 meters. And D is VHF, so it's at least in the same part of the spectrum, but it's a completely different band. That's the 1.25 band. Which amateur band includes 146.52 megahertz? Which amateur band is that in? Delta, 2 meters, and extra points for the purpose, or for the person who can tell me, and the extra point is undying admiration. Anyway, extra points for he who can tell me, or she who can tell me, what the significance of 146.52 is. Little help, Mike? It would be a good emergency band, but, you know, that is the national calling frequency. I think Greg and Ron have it here. Which amateur band includes 146.52? It's 2 meters, and that is the significance of that frequency is that it's the national simplex calling frequency for 2 meters. So if you want to talk to somebody, you just don't know who to call. You get on there, you put up your call sign, and you ask, you know, I'm monitoring for contacts or something to that set. Okay, but if you're going to talk for more than a minute or two, you QSY to another frequency. So you're talking to somebody on there on 146.52. Say, hey, let's not tie up this frequency in case somebody else wants to talk. Let's QSY to 144.91 or whatever your other frequency is. And then you just go meet on that frequency to talk longer. On which HF bands does a technician class operator have phone privileges? Now, phone privileges, you might see this or hear it in different forms. Single sideband and phone are the same. Voice, you might hear it expressed as voice, but that also covers other things as well. So on which HF band does a technician class operator have phone privileges? On Bravo, 10 meter band only. On Charlie, 80 meter, 40 and 15 and 10 meter bands. You can use CW on those. Which of the following frequency ranges are available for phone operation by technician class licensees? Charlie, 28.3 to 28.5. Very good. Where may single sideband phone be used in amateur bands above 50 megahertz? No. Let's see. I have does anybody remember this from the material that you read? Okay. It is in at least some portion or some segment of all these bands. Now, I have a problem with this one, so I'm going to really suggest that you memorize that one, because if you use the materials, I can find one here. When you look at this, yellow is single sideband phone, and the only place that shows up is in 28.3 to 28.5. It doesn't show up anywhere else on the chart. But I think what they're looking at is USB phone and image, which is green, and it is on all portions on every band above 50 megahertz. So be sure you remember that one, because the materials that answer that question are somewhat confusing. So single sideband phone can be used in amateur bands above 50 megahertz in at least some segments of all of the bands above 50 megahertz. Which of the following VHF, UHF band segments are limited to CW only? This one's tricky. Remember what we said earlier about 219 to 220 is for fixed digital message forwarding system only. So you're not going to be doing CW on there. So we can eliminate Bravo. And we can eliminate Delta because Bravo is out. Okay. Band segments limited to CW only. There's only two little portions. How you doing, Scott? There's one seat left right up here next to Kushal. So 50 megahertz to 51 megahertz. And 144 to 144.1. Yeah, and actually that's a misprint there. The 51, it should be 50.1. So 50 to 50.1 and 144 to 144.1. And yeah. Okay, how may amateurs use the 219 to 220 megahertz segment? We've talked about this a couple of times already in the 1.25 meter band. Delta, fixed digital message forwarding systems only. Why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of an amateur band or subband? Okay, so if you set it right at the edge, so let's say we're looking at let's say we're looking at 10 meters and you've got 28.5 is the high end of the band. If you set it right at 28.5 and you try to transmit, what are you transmitting? All these choices are, let's see, to allow for calibration error so that modulation, okay, sounds reasonable. Okay. All right, takeaways. Part 97 definitions. FCC regulates and enforces amateur radio service rules. The basis and purpose of the amateur radio service is advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. Beacons are amateur stations transmitting communications for the purpose of observing propagation or related experimental activities. A space station has to be how high? 50 kilometers or more. Part 97C, willful interference is interfering with other amateur stations. Interfering with other amateur stations is never permitted. Volunteer regional frequency coordinators are amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeaters or auxiliary stations. They recommend transmit and receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations. Remember this chart, or at least have a good idea of it. Avoid tuning too close to the band edges because it'll put you over or under where you're allowed to transmit. And you also allow a little bit of room for calibration error and transmitter drift. When the transmitter starts to get warm, components get warm, and the frequency might tend to drift a little bit. Any questions?